Attorney General, and I have the honor of introducing the next panel, Understanding Digital Currency. So we all know that money makes the world go round, right? But I don't know about you, I'm getting a little dizzy as this world turns because I thought I understood currency. But apparently there's a whole lot I don't. And so I think all of us are really pleased that General Hood included this topic in this program. So we're really at the cutting edge today, and this is just a continuation of that. So I want to thank in advance this wonderful panel that Jim and the staff have put together. So let me briefly introduce them to you. Seated to my immediate right is Jerry Brito, the Executive Director of Coin Center, a nonprofit research and advocacy center focused on public policy issues facing cryptocurrency technologies such as Bitcoin. So obviously there's others he's going to tell us about as well. He also serves as adjunct professor of law at George Mason University. So he will give us an overview of what digital currencies are, especially decentralized currencies, what the technology is, how it works, and an overview of where we are in the regulatory landscape. Our next speaker will be Luke Sully, who's actually seated at my far right. Luke is the director at PricewaterhouseCoopers of the professional services firm. He co-founded PwC's Digital Currency Task Force, the first of the Big Four to support industry, regulators, and federal authorities in the emerging space of cryptocurrency and its related technology. And he's also the Director of Operations for Intelligence at PricewaterhouseCoopers. And he's going to talk about the current state of the industry and new technologies, the intersection with issues in the payment industry, in privacy and transparency, as well as the strategic threat environment and how the cryptocurrency fits into that. And then to sweep our panel, we have Andrew Pak, who's Assistant United States Attorney in the Economic Crime Unit, he's seated in the center here, of the United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey. He's the coordinator of that office's computer hacking and intellectual property section. He specializes in cybercrime prosecutions relating to data breaches, credit card fraud, identity theft, and other computer crimes. And he's prosecuting the largest credit card hacking case charged to date relating to hacks into 7-Eleven, JCPenney, Heartland Payment Systems, Hannaford Brothers, Visa, JetBlue, and others. And he's going to talk about how they're seeing cryptocurrencies being used by criminals. So, without further ado, we will leave plenty of time for questions because I know you're going to have them. I certainly do. So, without further ado, we'll start with Jerry.
Thank you, General Rosenblum, and thank you all for having me here today. So, I think it's my job to explain to you how this technology works in 15 minutes or less. Let's see if I can do it. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the world's first completely decentralized digital currency. And you know, we've had digital currencies for decades. If you think about World of Warcraft gold, if you think about Facebook credits, Microsoft points, airline miles, even the dollars in your PayPal account are a virtual currency. We've had them for decades. So what is it about Bitcoin that makes it unique? What makes it special? It's decentralized, right? It is the decentralized aspect of Bitcoin that makes it unique. It's the world's first completely decentralized digital currency. And what that means is that it's not issued or controlled by any company, by any bank, by any government. There is no Bitcoin company. There's no Bitcoin server. There's no CEO of Bitcoin. It's a peer-to-peer network. So why do we have this decentralization? What's important about it? Well, before the invention of Bitcoin, for two parties to transact online or to transact electronically always required a third-party intermediary between them. And the reason for that is something that's called double spending problem. So let me see if I can illustrate this. So if you think about cash, you don't need a third-party intermediary. Just two parties standing just together can transact. And so how does this work? Well, I take out a $100 bill and I hand it to you, and now you have it, and now I don't. And we don't need a third party between us, it's just us two. And we can verify this transaction has happened because we can look at our hands. And I no longer have the $100 bill, and now you have it. And so that's how cash works, and that's how there are no third party intermediaries between us. But let's think about online or electronically. If we wanted to accomplish the same thing electronically, what would that look like? Well, we would have to represent the $100 bill digitally in some way. So it would be some kind of digital file, some digital $100 file, and I could then attach that to a message and send it to you. And so then now you'd have it. But question, when I attach a Word document or a photo to an email and I send it to you, now you have it, but is it deleted from my computer? No. I retain a perfect digital copy of that file that I just sent you. And if it was a $100 bill file, I would retain a perfect copy of that $100 that I just sent you, so I could spend it a second time, send it to a second person, and a third person, and a fourth person. And so this is something that computer scientists called the double spending problem. And so we could not have electronic cash online. And the way we solved this problem was by employing a third-party intermediary, somebody like PayPal or Visa or MasterCard, Bank of America. And what a intermediary does, a third-party intermediary does, is that I trust the intermediary and I have an account with it. You trust the intermediary and you have an account with it. And basically what it does is that it keeps a ledger. It keeps a ledger of my account and my balance, your account and your balance. And when I want to send you money, I don't send a message to you. I actually send a message to the intermediary, to PayPal. And I say, please deduct $100 from my account and add it to yours. And so that's what PayPal does. They deduct it from mine, add it to yours, and that reconciles to zero. And across all transactions, across all customers, at the end of the day, all transactions reconcile to zero. PayPal essentially is just a keeper of a giant ledger that is for all of its customers. So that's how we solve the double spending problem online, electronically, before the invention of Bitcoin. Then comes along Bitcoin, and what Bitcoin does for the first time is that it allows for pure transactions just between two parties online for the first time. So how does it do this? Essentially, Bitcoin still maintains a ledger, just like PayPal does. This ledger in Bitcoin is called the blockchain. But unlike PayPal or other intermediaries, the ledger is not kept by a single central authority that we each have to trust to reconcile the transactions. The ledger is shared in a peer-to-peer network among all the users of the system. So there are thousands of persons connected to the Bitcoin network. They each have a copy of a ledger. It's a public ledger that anybody can see, and it's distributed in this peer-to-peer fashion. And so that solves the double spending problem without having a third-party intermediary. And so now for the first time, we can have true electronic cash, where I can send you $100, and now you have it, and now I don't, and there's nobody between us except this network. So, well, that's what I just said. Why decentralization? What is the benefit of this? There are lots of benefits. I'm going to go through some of them. But one that's obvious is if you think about typically how we do it today, there are a lot of moving pieces between the sender and the recipient of the cash. There are a lot of permissioning that has to happen. There's a lot. Everybody along the way takes a cut. Bitcoin and systems like it replace these intermediaries with simply free software and an internet connection. And this is not just cheaper and faster in some respects. It also allows for new innovation that wasn't possible before, when in order to innovate, you had to get the permission of the intermediaries between the merchant and the customer or the recipients of the cash. So let me try to dive in a little bit. What is it good for, right? What are some of the benefits? Again, as I said, it's relatively cheaper and faster. It's probably not as fast as existing credit card payments, but relative, for example, to global wire transfers, it might be faster. It's certainly cheaper than existing payment systems like credit cards. Remittances is another possible use of currencies like Bitcoin. Remittances from the developed world to the developing world is about a $500 billion a year industry. And it can be quite expensive for the folks who are sending money around the world. So for example, my mother's from Spain, and I recently helped her send money to her family there. And we used a pretty reputable common money transmitter, and it cost 5%. 5% of the amount that we sent to Spain to share the money. And so this should shock you, I hope, because we live in a world where if I want to make a live video call to Hong Kong right now, I could do that for free. But yet, if I want to send some ones and zeros to represent some value to my family in Spain, it costs 5% of the amount that I'm sending. And if I'm sending it to Kenya, it could be 10% to 20% to other parts of Africa. Bitcoin could bring that down potentially to 1% or less. It's also things that the current payment systems don't allow for, simply technically cannot do. So things like large cross-border payments, things like micropayments. If you think about micropayments, we're talking about payments that are pennies or fractions of a penny. And if you think about monetizing IP, today we often rely on advertising. You can imagine monetizing IP through micropayments. There's so much that we do today, like Wi-Fi, where we'd like to meter, but we can't meter because of the payment system. You can imagine paying for Wi-Fi at the airport rather than in chunks of 3 hours or a day pass, just paying by the second or by the kilobyte. That's not possible with our existing payment system. And probably most important is that you have applications beyond payments. Payments is sort of the first application of Bitcoin. But what you have to understand is that Bitcoin is a lot like the internet before it. It is an open platform for innovation. So let me see if I can explain this. Bitcoin, there's a economist from the Chicago Fed who wrote a primer about Bitcoin, and the way he explains Bitcoin is that he says that Bitcoin is a system for securely and verifiably transferring Bitcoins. And that sounds crazy and redundant. Let me see if I can explain it. What he means is that Bitcoin, capital B Bitcoin, the network, the protocol, the system, it's a system for securely and verifiably transferring these tokens that are called Bitcoins, lowercase b Bitcoins, right? So Bitcoin is ultimately a ledger that's shared by anybody who wants to join a network. So everybody here can join a Bitcoin network and share in this ledger. And it allows you to trade securely and verifiably so that, if I send you one, you can prove to the world that now you're the new owner and I'm not, of these tokens called Bitcoin. And to date, these tokens have represented money. They represented cash. So one Bitcoin today trades at about $250. So if I want to send you $250, I will send you one Bitcoin. But there's no reason why these tokens must represent cash. They could represent anything we can all agree they represent. They could represent a share of stock, or an acre of land, or an ounce of gold. And so now you can begin to see that anything you can do with a ledger, you can do with this software. And because it is open source and it is an open internet protocol like email or the web, anybody can build on top of this without seeking the permission of an intermediary. So that really opens up the many possibilities, and this is why so many venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and folks in finance and Wall Street are so interested in this technology. So how do you regulate a decentralized system? There's nobody to regulate, is what you might be thinking to yourself. There's no company behind Bitcoin. How do you regulate this? So at first blush it seems difficult, but what you have to understand is it's really no different than cash. Right? You can still regulate the uses of the cash, even if you don't regulate the cash itself. And this came to a head in November of 2013 when the Senate Banking Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee held hearings about Bitcoin to try to answer these questions. Can there be some sound regulatory framework around this? And what we heard from the experts who testified from government, law enforcement, outside experts, industry, is that, like the theme we've heard through, the panels today, Bitcoin's a technology. It can be used for illicit purposes, but it can be used for legal purposes as well, and there are many legitimate uses to the technology. It's less anonymous than cash, which might come as a surprise to you, since I'm sure you've read media accounts about how Bitcoin is anonymous. Bitcoin is not anonymous, it's actually pseudonymous, which is subtle, but it's important. Here's Edward Lowry from the US Secret Service testifying. He says that the public ledger feature of Bitcoin differentiates it and other decentralized digital currencies from many of the centralized digital currencies, such as e-gold and Liberty Reserve, and that the blockchain, this ledger, makes it harder for criminals to hide their illicit activity. And we've seen this recently. There was a DEA agent and a US Secret Service agent who were charged recently. They were investigating the Silk Road case, and they've been charged with stealing Bitcoins from the dark market that they were investigating. And this image that you see here is from the criminal complaint against these agents, where they show they look at the ledger, which is public, anybody can look at, it's certainly available to law enforcement, and they can show the money being siphoned off from the black market and going to, in this case, this is the DEA agent who is charged. So this is publicly available for anybody to use, including law enforcement. So what you have to understand is cash is completely anonymous. If you have a cash transaction, let's say you and I meet at the flea market, I don't know you, you don't know me, we don't know each other's identities. You have a bike for sale. I have $100 and I say, I'll give you $100 for that bike. We make that trade, we part our separate ways. That's an anonymous transaction. There's no record kept of my name, of your name, of the amount, the date, the time. No record of that transaction. That's a completely anonymous transaction. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got, say, a credit card transaction. That's a completely identified transaction because the credit card company knows your name and information. They know my name and information, and there's a perfect record kept of the date, the time, the amount of the transaction. It's a perfectly identified transaction. Bitcoin sits in the middle. It's a pseudonymous transaction because there is, as we can see here, a perfect record kept of every transaction, the date, the time, the amount, and from which Bitcoin address to which Bitcoin address. What we don't have is identity necessarily tied to those Bitcoin addresses. But that's something that law enforcement using traditional detective work can try to ascertain. And there are increasingly techniques for doing analysis and forensics that helps you de-anonymize these addresses. And finally, new intermediaries are emerging. As you all know, intermediaries, such as payment processors or others, are who you might regulate, who you might go to seek law enforcement assistance. And even though Bitcoin, the protocol, there are no intermediaries necessarily in the system, if you want to buy Bitcoin because you want to use it to buy a t-shirt or to pay for some web hosting somewhere, you need to acquire that Bitcoin. So you would probably go to an exchange, perhaps somewhere like Coinbase, which is an exchange here in the US. And so these exchanges are intermediaries that are regulated. For example, they're subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, and they're compliant with Know Your Customer laws, and they file suspicious activity reports and do all of that. So you definitely have a whole ecosystem of intermediaries, whether it's exchanges, as I mentioned, payment processors. If you're a merchant and you want to accept Bitcoin payments, you'll have merchant processors. Any number of intermediaries are now emerging that are compliant with regulation and can assist law enforcement. So that is sort of a quick overview of what a technology is. So what is the regulatory landscape right now? At the federal level, it's what you see here. You have anti-money laundering. You have the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the Treasury Department. They issued guidance in March of 2013 explaining that Bitcoin companies, most Bitcoin companies, would qualify as money service businesses, and so therefore they must comply with the Bank Secrecy Act regulations, including carrying out know your customer and suspicious activity reporting, and we're seeing that happen today. The IRS issued guidance on Bitcoin's tax treatment. It treats it as property. There are, just this next week, we'll see folks for the first time filing their income tax returns with their gains or losses from Bitcoin. And so that is understood now. Financial regulation, you have the SEC and the CFTC. The SEC really has not done much. They've done some enforcement as it pertains to things like Ponzi schemes, where the medium of exchange to get into the Ponzi scheme happened to be Bitcoin, but really it's no different from their existing enforcement of Ponzi schemes. Where the SEC is looking at this Bitcoin is that there are applications for funds, ETFs, that would allow investors who want to acquire Bitcoin for investment purposes to do so easily through an ETF, and that's going through that application process and looks like it will be approved soon. The CFTC has been much more engaged. They have approved one market for Bitcoin derivatives, and there's an application pending for a second one. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been very engaged in looking at Bitcoin. They're very smart on the issue. They recently put out a notice of proposed rulemaking on prepaid products and included virtual currencies as potentially fitting in that rulemaking. We suspect that ultimately it won't be in there, and that they might have a special rulemaking for virtual currencies. And finally, you have other agencies looking at it as well, the FTC, the Federal Elections Commission, which has given a thumbs up to campaigns accepting Bitcoin donations. There are others as well. And finally, at the state level is where a lot of the activity is happening. Bitcoin businesses, by virtue of what they do, qualify as money transmitters. And so as a result, if you are a business, you need to acquire a money transmission license in each of every state in which you do business. And so for an internet company, that probably means every state before you can do business. Unfortunately, states have not been very quick to issue guidance about how their existing money transmission laws apply. And when Bitcoin businesses have applied for these licenses, many times they've been told, we're not ready to issue this yet, putting them in a kind of limbo. So we see states like Texas and Kansas, which have issued guidance saying that their existing laws just apply just as they are. So it's pretty straightforward. You have states like New York, which have decided that their existing money transmission laws are just too antiquated to take this new technology into account. And so they have proposed a whole new licensing scheme just for digital currencies. So in New York, that's called the BIT license. It's proposed, and we expect to see it finalized soon. It's got its pros, it's got its cons. For one thing, they duplicate, and in fact, even more narrowly, more broadly, the federal government's anti-money laundering efforts. And then recently, we've seen states like California, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey looking at introducing amendments to their money transmission licensing that take this technology into account. So that is a quick overview. There's a lot more to learn as far as the regulatory particulars, a lot more that I could go into in the technology. Coin Center exists to be a resource to policymakers, to the media, to law enforcement, who want to understand this technology and who want to understand what are the regulatory implications. So to the extent you have any questions on anything today or in the future, please do not hesitate to reach out and ask us anything. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. We will now turn to Luke Sully. Come on up, Luke. Oh, unless you want to just speak from there, that's fine too. Sure.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a great honour to be here, not only to speak to such a distinguished audience, but also because I got caught in a thunderstorm flying in last night. so I wasn't actually quite sure whether I was going to make it. As I was hurtling towards the earth at some undisclosed location, my passenger said to me, "So this is what they mean by Southern hospitality." But nonetheless, it's very nice to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of the technology and some of the value propositions and use cases for the technology, and then move over to talk a little bit more about the strategic threat environment. I think we can best categorize the current state of the industry in sort of three ways. One, there is now growing interest from Wall Street. Two, there is more and more investment in the security of the technology, which I think is very good from a consumer protection and from a regulatory compliance perspective. But also there's, I think, still inconsistency amongst consumer and merchant adoption as well. And I'll just qualify that with some data points first. So all told, venture capital investment in this ecosystem is a little shy of $700 million. And that far outstrips investment in the internet in the mid-90s. And I don't necessarily think a comparison with the internet is an apples for apples comparisons, but I think it's adequate enough for this purpose. Over 50% of the volume of exchange trading actually takes place in China. Although, as I said, a lot of this money, a lot of the venture capital money that's propping up the industry is predominantly from the US. A recent survey from the Electronic Transfer Association found that about a quarter of the merchants that were surveyed on whether they would adopt Bitcoin said that they would consider it in the next 2 years. So right now I think there's around about 90,000 merchants that accept it, and 3 million wallets, which is for you and I wanting to use Bitcoin, we would need to open a wallet and buy the Bitcoin or the access to the system at least with an online wallet. So there's about 3 million wallets and about 90,000 merchants, I think, all told right now. And as I said, Wall Street interest is increasing. So we've seen UBS, Citi, Barclays are all now publicly stating that they are investing time and resources to explore the technology. So what does this really mean? It reflects, I think, a variety of use cases right now. The takeaway, as Jerry pointed out, is that the blockchain, which is this online ledger that everybody can download of every transaction that took place, allows people to move and hold assets of any type. And the decentralized nature means that it reduces the chance of double spending. So why would Wall Street really be interested in this? It's sort of anathema to quite a lot of what Wall Street is about, what they do. I think some of the answer actually is it can be found in PwC's, again, this isn't an advert for PwC, but 3 years ago, PwC, we started to get really interested in this topic, and we built a task force and called it the Digital Currency Task Force. And then we changed the name to Virtual Currency Task Force, and then we changed the name again to Cryptocurrency Task Force. And now we've settled on Crypto Finance Technology. So no comments, please, about consultants overcomplicating things. But I think, Wall Street interest is based around, I think, one key concept. And that it goes back to the centralized and decentralized nature. There are a system of centralized bodies around the world, banks, clearing systems, where parties, yourselves, organizations, they trust those organizations to manage their assets and manage the system in an appropriate way. What it does is it gives you singular points of failure, and as a result, regulatory bodies focus their efforts on protecting the data, protecting the consumers, promoting good behavior. What the blockchain does is this verification process, which is decentralized, where everybody around the world has a copy of the ledger. It provides a technology solution that enables relationships to, without centralized third-party involvement. So really the impact of that is that the technology can cut out the middleman, and as it's internet-based, there are faster and cheaper ways of moving things around. But the really interesting part is that the technology now allows you to separate control and trust. And these are quite interesting concepts. Concepts that are now taking place in today's world. So if you look at millennials are happy to give up privacy in exchange for convenience. Social media has allowed an online open source inclusive system to verify, to capture data, to verify reputations, to move information around the world. It's concepts of old power and new power, of decentralized and centralized. And they're creeping slowly through. And I think what we're seeing with Bitcoin and blockchain technologies is another manifestation of that. So for financial services, this technology essentially creates the ability to break down financial products and services into its constituent parts of trust and control, and allows you to redesign them. So how do we manage our identity? Blockchain. How do we control digital rights and contracts? The blockchain. Where is there current friction in the financial system? How do treasury functions around the world operate in a more effective way? Blockchain. How do you move remittances faster and cheaper? How do you get access to the underbanked and the unbanked, particularly in emerging markets, where the old adage of, why are there no telephone poles in Africa? Because they skip levels of development. They go straight to the smartphone. So how do you access the underbanked to the unbanked? What is that promise of ubiquity? That's blockchain. That's what the advocates would say. There are implications on privacy, and there are a variety of threats that are emerging, which Andrew, I think, will talk to. So shifting the focus a little bit. Why would a cyber thief be interested in this? Well, I think it's because you can irreversibly steal something. So rather like cash, you can irreversibly steal something. There's no deposit insurance for consumers, and you can move it internationally very fast. So there are some really interesting value propositions for cyber criminals. Yes, we are seeing the potential for money laundering to take place, and PwC's built a number of case studies where we've created terrorist financing situations and tried to leverage blockchain and Bitcoin. And actually, it's a really interesting way as part of the layering process to use. I think the strategic threat angle does create real challenges here for US regulators and law enforcement. Defining and monitoring suspicious activity is going to be really critical. I think cybercrime will move very fast, particularly to operate in jurisdictions where there are weak existing AML sanctions regimes. I think it does challenge traditional concepts of jurisdiction over the internet. And you have perhaps the age-old problem of where servers are held in less favorable jurisdictions. There's also one other component from a strategic threat perspective, which we're just actually waiting for the first case to happen, which is an FCPA case involving bribery payments of using crypto. And I think, again, it's going to be very difficult establishing evidentiary proof for prosecutions in this particular area. It's going to require disclosure from the recipients on their wallets and on their data surrounding their ownership and control of Bitcoins. It's actually been, I think, historically quite difficult and challenging to explain the concept of Bitcoin and its related technology in prosecutions. And it does throw up some really interesting questions around the right to privacy as well. So we're expecting to see more interesting value propositions turn up on the illicit side, from bribery, from corruption, from tax evasion. And there is I think one of the challenge statements here is, if you consider offshoring the ecosystem, the payment processors, the exchanges, if they start to move offshore, where will they go? And will you have the regulatory reach to monitor? And I think those, for me, pose some of the more interesting questions around this topic for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now turn to Andrew. And we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us.
All right, thank you. So what I want to do is I want to go over some case examples, the types of places that we're seeing cyber criminals use Bitcoin. And it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And I'm also work for the federal government, so I have the same disclaimer that Jay had. None of what I say is the opinion of the DOJ. I'm not going to really be talking about cases that are pending, but I will talk about a few interesting cases. And I want to start with the use of Bitcoin to pay for contraband. This is the most obvious use you think of. You've probably seen and heard about the Silk Road case. There's Bitcoin involved in that. But in a lot of situations, when you're dealing with cyber criminals, the reason that they interact with Bitcoin is because they use it as a form of exchanging funds. One example I want to talk about is fakeplastic.net. It's a case that we charged in the District of New Jersey. And to understand how this case works and what this guy was offering on this website, you have to understand a little bit about the carding industry. I refer to it as a carding industry. That the name comes from credit card fraud, bank card fraud, and it really describes the industry built around the theft of payment card numbers. That usually comes in the form of hacks into major networks, 7-Eleven, JCPenney. You've heard about hacks into Target, Home Depot, those types of networks where criminals steal what is known as dumps or credit card data. The type of data that shows up on the back of your credit card on that magnetic strip. Hackers will steal that information and then they'll sell that information on the black market. If you're, and that's the hacking side, that's how you get the data. The second aspect of the carding industry is monetization of that information. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can monetize that stolen credit card information, but one way is to sell it to folks who will then encode that stolen credit card information on the back of a counterfeit card, right? They'll encode it, and they'll use that card, at stores all over the country, all over the world, in order to essentially enter into unauthorized transactions, buy iPads or buy gift cards, and turn that into cash. It used to be that and I'll call them the cashers, that the monetization side would buy prepaid credit cards, would use green dot cards, anything with a magnetic strip on the back. Sometimes they just order PVC, like white plastic cards, and encode that information. And the danger for that is that if you're dealing with a store and you're dealing with a good cashier, they're going to look at the card and they're going to see that the transaction doesn't make sense. That this person, has this white card or has this, a gift card and is, charging money as if it were a credit card. And so that creates alarm. So what this guy did, Sean Roberson, is he created a website called fakeplastic.net, and it was focused at these caching crews. And what you could do at Fake Plastic, and by the way, the reason I bring this up is because he obviously accepted Bitcoin for his services. But what you could do at Fake Plastic was pretty interesting. Now that's going to be hard to see, but I'll show you a blowout. If you're a criminal and you have the stolen credit card information, you would go to this website, you would pick from any number of templates, and these are all counterfeit cards that he would create. And you would pick that, and you would then post the stolen credit card information that you wanted onto his website. He would then take your numbers, he would emboss them onto the card, he'd send them to you within 24 hours. He was actually very good at making sure people got their orders in time. And you would then have a counterfeit card that had somebody else's information on it, that had the number embossed on it that matches the 4 digits that you would see on the receipt, so that if the cashier is looking at that receipt, it would look like a legitimate transaction. It would have a name that you chose, and it would be a name that would match some fake ID that you or your crew members had access to. He also sold things like these little hologram stickers that you could put on the cards. Now, one of the reasons, and I'll talk a little bit more, he has a posting on his website as to why he specifically chose Bitcoin. But one of the reasons that we see this kind of usage in this kind of scenario, as well as other illegal websites and other cyber criminals selling things online, is because, as Jerry had mentioned, the beauty of Bitcoin, its efficiency in terms of its technology, what it offers is a lack of intermediaries, right? And when you remove the intermediary process, you remove companies that would have to follow regulations such as know your customer. And so you remove those kinds of risks. As we'll see later in this presentation, you don't completely remove those risks for the criminals because of the way they end up using Bitcoin, but that is the value that it has to these criminals. Another way that we see Bitcoin being used is for ransomware. Has anybody seen anything like this on their computer before? Or a friend that had ransomware, a crypto locker, or anything like that on their computer? Yeah, I see at least one hand. What will happen sometimes is you or a family member will be, using your computer, and eventually there'll be, and there's all different types of versions of this software. There'll be an alert basically saying that your computer is going to be encrypted. It's going to be locked down, which basically it's not quite deleting the data on your computer, but it's encrypting it in a way that you can no longer make good use of it. And the reason it's called ransomware is because the only way to get the password to unlock your computer and to get your photographs, your videos back is to pay whoever's ransoming you in Bitcoin. The reason they use Bitcoin, again, is because of the lack of intermediary. It allows them to receive this money from victims in a somewhat anonymous way, and I'll touch upon that a little bit. But as Jerry mentioned in the first part of his presentation, Bitcoin is not truly anonymous. This is true. It is pseudonymous, but it is very easy if you set it up early enough in advance to set up your Bitcoin transactions so that it is very difficult for law enforcement to actually figure out what accounts that you're using, even if you can see all the different accounts that the Bitcoin passes through. We've seen Bitcoin as an investment. So that fake plastic website that I told you about, the defendant's name is Sean Roberson. I don't think this picture, you can see it so well, but those are racks of processing units. They're basically like they look like little servers. They basically have a graphics processing unit, and they're designed to mine Bitcoins. And Jerry didn't talk about what mining is, but I'll talk about it a little bit. And if you have technical questions about that, direct them to him. The idea of mining is essentially, there's this public ledger, right, that both panelists refer to that keeps track of all the transactions. Well, there has to be an incentive for maintaining that ledger. There has to be an incentive for computers to go out there and do the processing required to maintain, distribute, and keep that ledger accurate. The incentive is Bitcoin mining. So if you have certain software you run, you're basically crunching numbers for the Bitcoin system, and the value that you get is every once in a while, if you're lucky enough and if you have enough processing power, you will get your own Bitcoin for free. Or not for free, in exchange for the electricity and the processing power that you put into the system. So what this guy did with all the money that he made selling counterfeit credit cards is he doubled down on Bitcoin. He went out and he bought as many GPUs as he could, and he started mining on his own. And that's a form of money laundering because he was doing that. He was doing that as an investment, basically to fund his business. He would take profits from that and add new printers that he used to make his business grow bigger, wider, to hire people to send the counterfeit cards as they received orders. So that's Bitcoin as an investment in and of itself that we see criminals using. And the interesting thing there is figuring out how to seize this stuff and actually how to monetize it back for the United States government, because as Jerry stated that when you're dealing with exchanging Bitcoins into dollars, you're dealing with something that would normally be a licensed money exchange, right? A money exchange would actually do that. If you do it in an unlicensed fashion, it can be illegal depending on what state you're in. And when you seize Bitcoin and Bitcoin wallets, that creates issues as to the best way to actually turn that back into dollars, for law enforcement. But they've come up with a system. They have a model that they've been using since the Silk Road case that seems to be working. Then there's Bitcoin as an investment through hacking, and this is an interesting case. It's not one of ours, but there's a headline from a case for the New Jersey State Attorney General. Going back to mining, as I said before in that other picture, there were these servers that were designed to mine Bitcoin. They were designed basically to crunch numbers all day until a new Bitcoin shows up in the owner's account, it's actually a valid investment. It works for a lot of people. Well, what the allegation was here was that there was this software designed for the gaming community. I don't mean gaming in this sort of way here, but I mean gaming as in online video games, first-person shooters, that sort of thing. There would be the software that you could get to prevent cheating, right? So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Call of Duty or any games like that, but there are these first-person shooters. You go out in teams, you play multiplayer games, and you basically try to kill each other. It's like paintball online. People, as in any other game, will find a way to cheat, and they'll have programs installed that will make sure that their accuracy is better than the other players. Well, in response to that, there's software that was sold basically to prevent cheating. So everybody who wants to play fairly, who wants to play by the ethical rules of this game, you install this on your computer, and it will prevent cheating. Well, according to these allegations, what happened here was that that software didn't just prevent cheating. At some point, it took over the graphics processing unit for the computer and actually had that computer mining Bitcoins for the owner. This is one example. We've actually seen this kind of thing in the news coming out more frequently because now, it's not only that Bitcoin is valuable, right? It's the processing power that generates Bitcoins that's valuable. And if you think about computers being hacked, I mean, what we think about nowadays is data breaches into big companies where you steal financial information. Data breaches, on a personal level where they steal money or information from you or from your computer. But now we've got a new kind of data breach where the theft is actually the use of your computer so that somebody can take your computer, make it part of an army of sort of zombie infected computers that are then just processing Bitcoin, in support of whoever it is that's running that hack network. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about crypto versus virtual. Now, there is a difference between cryptocurrency and virtual currency, and going back to that case of Sean Roberson and his website, they used to accept a currency known as Liberty Reserve. It was an online currency that a lot of criminals used, and it was the subject of a takedown in May of 2013. It's a centralized virtual currency that was used. And the difference, again, between that and Bitcoin is that if it's centralized, there is a single building, or a set of buildings that is responsible for dealing with all the transactions. And law enforcement can come in and seize the computers from that building, seize the business records from that building, and see all the transactions that took place. Bitcoin is a little bit different. As Jerry had mentioned before, law enforcement can see all the transactions that take place. You can see when Bitcoin A goes through wallet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can see all of that. You just don't necessarily know who owns wallets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I mean, you can figure that out through many ways, but the way you can't figure it out is you can't just subpoena that information from a company. There's not a single centralized figure to get that process from. And I thought this was interesting because, as we often see with these kinds of cases, we have somebody who's a good businessman, who's a good criminal, but he doesn't spell so good, you'll see. I'll read this. I just want to read this to you. This was a notice after the Liberty Reserve takedown when he decided to move his payment method, primary payment method, to Bitcoin. And it says, so for anyone that hasn't heard, Liberty Reserve was shut down indefinitely for money laundering. What does this mean for fake plastic? It means we are going to accept Bitcoin as our primary payment system. What about perfect money or web money, which is centralized virtual currencies like Liberty Reserve? These sites are well known for shutting off accounts and freezing funds. It is only a matter of time before the U.S. shuts down perfect money for the same reasons they did LR. I strongly urge everyone who is working in our line of work to start using Bitcoin. Bitcoin cannot be shut down by any person or government. It cannot track your ass down. It is anonymous and safe. It is why Silk Road, I think he meant Silk Road there, largest drug buying marketplace, has always used Bitcoin as a payment processor. And I would say that, he was half right, in the sense that it cannot be shut down by the government, or at least be very difficult. It's not something that you would see happen in the course of a criminal case. But where he was wrong, again, is that Bitcoin is not completely anonymous. This term pseudonymous, the first time I heard it was at one of these things a few months ago, but it does accurately capture the situation where you know where the currency is going. You just don't know who owns the various buckets that currency is traveling through. And lastly, I want to talk about just sort of to step back from case specifics and talk a little bit about generically how we're seeing criminals use Bitcoin. Now, for those of you that have friends or relatives or acquaintances that actually use and transact in Bitcoins, they're usually, the one with the Google glasses or like the Apple Watch right now. They're usually the ones that are very into the technology aspect of it. And they want to treat it like a currency. It's like, oh, I can go buy a soda with Bitcoin. But I mean, we're not there yet. And to the extent that we get there, I mean, that could be a great situation. But that's not where we are. And certainly, that's not where the criminals are. The criminals want to use Bitcoin as a method from getting cash from point A to point B. So they use what I refer to as an exchange model of the currency, not a currency model. Bitcoin in and of itself is not what they want to keep in their pockets. You can't go to a club and make it rain Bitcoin, at least not yet. So, they follow the dollar model, right? So the reason that that's useful for us to know, going back to this notion of whether Bitcoin is anonymous, is that when you're following an exchange model, you have to use more and more intermediaries. And this is typically where regulation can be useful. This is where criminal investigations can be pinpointed and targeted at figuring out who's transferring Bitcoins. Because if I'm the guy that's receiving Bitcoin for illegal activity, and I'm following an exchange model, I want those dollars, I want to be able to make it rain, I still need somebody else to transact with me in dollars. I still need to extract that. And that's where you can have regulation, that's where you can have investigations, and that's where you can have a lot of good information as to who in particular is using, you know, the Bitcoin wallet that you're seeing receiving a lot of Bitcoins for illegal activity. So, you know, that's it in terms of my presentation, and, you know, I'll take questions with the group. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start us off with a question because I'm confused. And I'm going to ask Luke to start us off with the answer. Is Bitcoin fundamentally good or bad?
It's neither. It's just a piece of technology. It's completely agnostic, I think, and perhaps that's a running theme. And it sounds like I'm dodging the answer as well. No, I think it's. I still think, and to Andrew's point, that cash is still going to be king, and this is just a mechanism to find way cash to places quicker, from a criminal perspective. I think some of the underlying technology that we haven't gone into detail about, the use cases are starting to become clearer, and they're very, very exciting. And it's something I think that PwC is getting very excited about in terms of how we can use it, particularly around the Internet of Things. And so but again, we've all got to take a step back. I mean, this is, you know, when did the concept only came out in 2009. So, you know, I don't think nascent is even the right word yet, but this thing's taken off at an incredible pace. Regulations trying to understand and make sure that people are protected to a certain degree. But in terms of its inherent, is this an inherently bad thing? No, it's just a piece of technology.
You didn't say whether it was good. But that's okay. Well,
if you like technology, I don't know.
I bet Andrew might have an opposing viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I actually don't. I think you know, Bitcoin is a lot like, you know, alcohol. It has wonderful positive uses, and
until the next morning.
If misused, it can be dangerous because, you know, for the same reasons that it can be a social lubricant, it can also cause havoc. So, you know, so we take the view. I mean, you'll notice it. Sort of what I was talking about in terms of the way we're seeing Bitcoin being used. You know, the Bitcoin in and of itself wasn't a factor. It wasn't sort of the end goal, right? I mean, even if Bitcoin is seen as an investment by a cyber criminal, it's not about the fact that this person had Bitcoin or was mining Bitcoin. It was the purpose behind that. It was, you know, what was being exchanged for it. So, you know, I don't see it as a particularly good or bad thing. It creates new issues for us. You know, prosecuting cases to try and figure out, for example, who was behind a particular wallet. But you know, and in some ways it does make it harder for us to go forward on cases with that aspect. But you know, with good, as Jerry had mentioned, with good investigative work and techniques, there are ways to figure out. Just like it's, you know, it's not easy to figure out who's using a particular email account. There are ways to figure that out, and it's not just sending a subpoena and getting a response. The same way with Bitcoin, if you do enough investigation, you can typically figure out who's benefiting from a particular wallet. You know, there are these things now called Bitcoin tumblers, which makes that job a little bit more difficult. Which is, you know, it's kind of it's when you create a single intermediary wallet that will handle hundreds, if not thousands, of transactions in a day, and will handle them in a way so that it's hard to figure out. It sort of obfuscates that trail between wallets. See, that's something I think that we have to overcome and deal with. But again, there are ways to do that.
So, yeah. So I'd like to propose a different analogy than alcohol. I think it's like fire. in that, fire is a wonderful thing. It can help you cook a meal, it can help you warm a home, but it could also be used to raise a village. And it's how you use it, as you were saying. And we've seen this movie before. When the internet, the commercial, sort of consumer internet first emerged, there was a lot of sort of panicking, to be honest, about its potential, what it would mean for our kids, for criminal use, et cetera. And fundamentally, like fire, I think the internet is a good thing that can be put to bad uses, and we have to be careful with those. If you think about the automobile, when the automobile first emerged, who were the first people to really take to it? It was bank robbers, because the police were still on foot, and so you could have a getaway car, rob a bank, hop in the automobile, and run away, and the cop couldn't catch you. And so we see this movie over and over where there's a new technology. The first folks who gravitate to using it are not you and me, it's criminals. And so it takes a while for law enforcement to catch up. Eventually they do. And eventually we all can benefit from something that's fundamentally good, like the automobile, that can also be put to bad uses.
Thanks. Very provocative answers. Appreciate them. So let's go to the audience and get some questions.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank the panel. I think that was a fascinating and really informative discussion of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. I have a question, I guess, about the future. Luke just mentioned how nascent this technology is. I want you to look forward 10 years, 20 years. Is Bitcoin going to be the winner in this space, or will it be Litecoin or Dogecoin or yet to be imagined coin? And secondly, how much of a winner will it be? Are we all going to have switched to one of these currencies, one of these methods of transacting, or will we still have bank accounts and cash and credit cards and PayPal and whatever else, and a Bitcoin account and a yet to be imagined coin account?
Sure. So it's a great question, and as you mentioned, there are other cryptocurrencies, right? So Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency. Before Bitcoin, you only had centralized digital currencies. When you talked about digital currencies, the virtual currencies, you were just talking about things like e-gold or Liberty Reserved or World of Warcraft gold, currencies that were sort of issued by companies, centrally managed. Bitcoin was the first one that solved this double spending problem, brought the innovation, created what we know as cryptocurrency, which is another way of saying decentralized currency. So today you have centralized digital currencies and decentralized digital currencies. Bitcoin's the first decentralized digital currency. Once it is released and people can see, it's an open source product, I now understand how it operates. I can take that, sometimes even just copy the code itself because it's open source, change a few lines maybe to add some features that Bitcoin doesn't have, et cetera, and you launch a new coin. And so as a result, we have dozens of essentially Bitcoin clones with different features on the margin. So you mentioned Litecoin, Dogecoin, these are all examples. And we have dozens of those. And so the question is, which is going to be the winner? And I don't know if I can look 10, 20 years out ahead. I think that's trying to predict that it's a fool's game. But I can tell you this, that the reason we're here talking about Bitcoin and not about Litecoin, this wasn't a panel about Litecoins, it was a panel about Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin being the first has the first mover advantage. It has the network effect. And if you look at number of nodes on the network, the the capitalization of the digital currencies, if you look at the amount of investment, et cetera, number of users, number of transactions per day, they are all order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude larger than the next closest competitor, which might be Litecoin or something like that. So if I had to guess, it would be Bitcoin. That said, you could imagine new innovation that's even more remarkable, maybe easier to use, faster, et cetera. So I would put my money on Bitcoin. And as far as it disrupting other technologies, I don't think Bitcoin is a competitor or displacer of fiat currency. I don't think we're, in my lifetime, going to stop using the dollar or the euro and hold Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is going to be used as a facilitator of different things that we want to achieve. And so there, I think there's some existing business lines that could be effective. So from money remittances to, anyhow, lots of different things.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I guess if I knew the answer, I'd be on my yacht somewhere in the Caribbean, just enjoying life. But I think I think the world can coexist with a variety of different ways to pay people. You have now, and again, I come back to a couple of concepts, right? How do millennials operate? How do they interact with the world? What do they want? And the only reason PwC spends a lot of time is because a lot of the people we hire are millennials, so we have to understand what are their likes and dislikes. And again, they've given up privacy for convenience. They're happy to use multiple ways across the internet to do certain things. So I think this does fit into that, and I think you can find models where there will be payment systems that will coexist. I think Jerry and I have talked a bit about this over the course of the day. What are the next sort of credentializing moments that's going to tip it one way or the other? There's a variety. I do think that, again, another fundamental concept is that this concept of decentralizing verification of activity so that you don't need a central point of trust, that's where you're going to get really interesting kind of longer term value propositions. So at the moment we've got Bitcoin, which is completely decentralized. I mean, there are mining, so the processing power sits everywhere in the world, and it gets increasingly more complex to solve these computing problems. And so the rate of processing power that you need to do this has increased exponentially, blown Moore's law out of the water. And so you have vast warehouses of these GPUs, or ASICs now, in Iceland and Georgia, the country, not Georgia, the state here, because again, it's cheap electricity and it's cold. So as a byproduct of this entire ecosystem, you have commercially available processing power, which is 100,000 times more powerful than your iMac, and that's right now, and it's only growing. That's a long way of saying you will find decentralized ledgers, decentralized value propositions that will probably move back from the Bitcoin 100% decentralized and sit somewhere between a decentralized model but has trusted nodes in the middle of it. So you may have a US government node, you may have these trusted nodes that are still producing verification of data that's moving across to in a cryptographic way, or leveraging a basic understanding of cryptography in order to verify that these assets are held. That's probably a terrible answer, but I don't know if there'll be a coin. I think the currency value prop I'm not sure about.
Who pays for the servers in Georgia or Iceland, and how do they get paid? Where's their cut come from?
Okay, so here comes the mining question. This is so we've been talking about mining, and let me say this: so mining is the worst possible name that could have been given to this activity. A better name for it would be payment processing. So what miners do is that they take the place of PayPal. So if you remember my example, you had PayPal in the middle, who you and I, who have accounts there, pay to keep up this ledger. In the Bitcoin model, you don't have one PayPal, you have thousands of miners. And essentially they do what PayPal does. They contribute to keeping up the ledger, making sure that it is secure and verified. That's what these miners are. And the more mining capacity you throw at the network, the more secure it is. And also the incentive, so what's the incentive for you to be a miner? It's income. There are two income streams that miners have. Number one is mining fees, so payment processing fees. Just like PayPal, when I send you $100, PayPal takes a cut from your end of that payment. Miners do the same thing, except it's a much infinitesimally smaller cut right now. So that's one income stream. It's mining fees, which are basically payment processing fees. The second income stream, as Andrew was mentioning, is what's called a mining reward, which is new Bitcoin. So the way the new Bitcoin is introduced into the money supply is that every 10 minutes, right now, every 10 minutes, 25 new Bitcoins are introduced into the money supply. And who gets those 25 Bitcoins? The miner that successfully adds the next block to the blockchain, the next page in the ledger. It's kind of complicated, and if you really want to understand mining, it's the sort of thing where it's complicated but not difficult to understand, but it would probably take me 20 to 30 minutes with a whiteboard, and I could explain it to you exactly how the cryptography works. But again, suffice it to say, mining is payment processing. It's distributed, so there's not one payment processor, there are thousands, and they are rewarded for their efforts, and so that's why they invest in having these machines upkeeping the ledger.
And if I want a Bitcoin, do I go to a website, create an account, and somehow give them a credit card or whatever for $250 and
Correct.
worth, and then I've got one Bitcoin in my account?
Yes, correct. And so this is interesting, again, because it's you and I are not about to create mining rigs to try to mine new Bitcoin. The way that we would acquire Bitcoin is that we would create an account with an exchange, someone like itBit or Coinbase or Circle. And these are new intermediaries that, again, they do know your customer. So before you can buy that Bitcoin, they want to know your information. And they comply with BSA, so they're registered with FinCEN. They submit suspicious activity reports. When there is a ransomware case or something like this, I know that companies like Coinbase proactively reach out to the victims of these attacks, and they help them to the best of their ability. And they also do the following. They will tag the Bitcoin addresses associated with those ransomware attacks, so that if the proceeds of one of those attacks comes to their servers, they will contact law enforcement.
In reading about Bitcoin, one of the features that I've noticed and looking at the charts is the incredible volatility of the value of Bitcoin in relation to the dollar. Saying today it's about 250. I think within the last couple of years it's been well over 1,000 at times. My question is that sort of an inherent attribute of Bitcoin, this volatility, or do you think that sort of as it becomes more widely adopted, it'll become more stable and actually work as a store of value as opposed to just a medium of exchange?
I'll let the experts talk about it afterwards, but I do think that the reason that it sort of depends on how Bitcoin ends up being used. If people still use it as an investment, if people still use it only as a medium of exchange and not something that they treat as a currency, then I think you will see more volatility, because when you have more people treating it as an investment, then you have people sort of shorting and going long on it as an investment, which causes volatility in the marketplace. If everyone treated it the way we treat dollars currently, you'd have more stability, because there'd be less people going in and out of the currency or the medium, just on a whim, on speculation, on investment. People would stay in it because they need it to pay for gas, to buy food, etc. So I think, any currency that's not treated as a currency and it's treated as an investment is going to face that kind of volatility. That is at that point you're calling it an investment. That is an inherent aspect of an investment. But if it's treated as a currency, then that would be different. And that goes back to the initial question that we heard before as to whether or not Bitcoin or some other digital currency would catch on as a currency.
And I think also, sorry, just to follow up on that, you can either treat it like an investment, treat it like a currency, but it's taxed like a property. So it's not the easiest thing, from some of these regulatory perspectives to get some sort of clarity of purpose, and particularly around asset classification, which is an issue that we've internally have talked a lot about. It provides confusion, and so if you can't necessarily use it to buy, a Coca-Cola, and it's not being used in that particular way, that's going to have an impact on the price, rather like all the external events have had an impact on the price, rather like hoarding, has an impact on the price. All these are contributing factors to consumer adoption, and merchants and consumers both look at each other, I think, and say, well, who's going to blink first? I mean, we'll get in when we see the consumer adoption, and the consumers are like, well, unless I can use it at such and such, I don't really want to get involved. So there's a variety of factors that play into that, and I think that's why there's so much volatility, because there's attitudes are so different, and it's so nascent.
So I don't think Bitcoin is ever going to be as stable as, say, the US dollar, because the US dollar has a central bank, the Fed, whose job it is to keep it stable. I think Bitcoin, if you look at it, it's a lot more like gold, where it is going to be volatile. That said, probably the main reason that Bitcoin to date has been as volatile as it has been is that it's a very liquid market. There are very few people who hold it and who want to trade. And so as a result, any small enough transaction can send the price swinging. So as more people hold Bitcoin, the price will hopefully become more stable. I think you also to date have not had derivative instruments to hedge against price volatility, to bet against Bitcoin. And of course now we're seeing these instruments coming from regulated markets approved by the CFTC. And as those come online, I suspect we'll see the volatility subside. And actually, there's a great website called btcvol.info. And if you go there, it's an economist who put together this website, and it just tracks on a real-time basis Bitcoin's historic volatility starting in 2009. And the graph is like this. Volatility is empirically subsiding, even though it's still pretty volatile.
For what purpose would I or most other people in this room want to use Bitcoin rather than the cash we use, the credit cards we use, or the checks? I understood about perhaps sending, large swaths of cash to a different country, or the so-called, underworld. But for the average person, maybe we're not average, but for the folks in this room, what benefit or purpose would we have for using Bitcoin? Because I didn't quite grasp that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that there is a really good reason for the average person to have Bitcoin, right? Because you've got credit cards, and credit cards work really well. They're instantaneous. You can spend money that you don't have, right? Bitcoin doesn't let you do that, and often you get paid to use a credit card, right? You get frequent flyer miles or whatever. Bitcoin offers none of that. So two things I will say. One is that's a very US-centric, Western-centric view where we take for granted our access to credit cards and banking. In most of the world, people don't have credit cards, and people don't have bank accounts. And so if you are in Africa, and you want to begin to accept and use electronic payments, well, you could wait for a credit card network to come to your country and decide to come to your country, then allow you to be a merchant on that network, and then you can begin to take payments. Or if you have a smartphone and an internet connection, you can begin using Bitcoin. So I think for retail payments, for the kind of payments that you and I are going to want to use, probably it's not going to be the West. It's probably going to be the developing world. And so then the question is, well, what about the West? I don't think it's retail payments. I think it's things that our existing payment systems it's not possible to do with our existing payment system. So I mentioned some of those. Basically, it's really big payments and really small payments. If you think about really big payments, if you want to buy a house or a car, you can't put it on your credit card. And it's not because the technology doesn't exist. It's because the merchant, the person selling you the house or the car, isn't going to want to take the 2-3% hit on the sales price. The other thing is really small payments, like microtransactions. Those aren't possible today at all. And if you could allow them using a technology like Bitcoin, which is the first technology that really allows micropayments, we can imagine many new business models become possible.
But Bernie, you should also know that at least one candidate for president is now accepting Bitcoin as a campaign contribution. So there's a use for you. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Luke, I think you mentioned irreversible theft. How does that reconcile with the blockchain? Can you comment on the irreversible theft?
Yeah, drawing comparisons with cash, if I steal it out of your wallet, it takes a lot for you to get it back. I think it's still very, very difficult to actually reverse the transaction right now, given that current regulatory environment and the pace of law enforcement understanding is still quite nascent. So it does have those cash-like attributes. And there's no right of rescission, right? So who do I complain to that you've stolen my money?
And just what Jerry was mentioning before on the credit card in response to the last question, another difference between using a credit card and our financial system and Bitcoin is that if there's a fraud complaint or something on your card, you can get that money back because you can go back to your carrier, that financial institution that's backing your transaction. But there's no incentive for the Bitcoin system to resolve those issues, at least as of right now. Therefore, it is like a suitcase of cash. If it's not in your hands, it's not yours. And the ledger treats it as not being in your hands if on the blockchain it says it's in somebody else's hands. Yeah,
the verification process doesn't include whether you should have it. It's whether the coin is authentic. That's it. So the technology is agnostic as well.
You a NAAG coin in appreciation, and let's give a hand to our wonderful panel.